Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to the J Street Policy Center briefing, expert analysis on the Trump and Netanyahu meeting. My name is Adina Vogel-Ayalon, and I'm J Street's Vice President and Chief of Staff. And we are here today with two of our J Street Policy Fellows, Frank Lowenstein and Yael Patir, to discuss the latest news. Netanyahu is currently here in Washington, still here, holding meetings. This is his third time since Trump has returned to the White House. And he just had dinner with Trump at the White House last night. And we will be here to talk about some of the issues that they discussed yesterday. And we are also seeing reports in the last couple of hours that indicate that there is going to be another meeting also later today for them to continue discussing some topics. They answered some questions from reporters yesterday before their dinner about Gaza ceasefire negotiations, the Iran-Israel escalations, U.S. Airstrikes against Iran nuclear sites, the prospects of an Israel-Syria detente, among a series of other issues. And we will have the opportunity now to unpack them. I want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to put your questions to pose to Frank and Yael. And I will also note that this conversation is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to view it later today or to share from our YouTube channel and rewatch if you are so inclined, and also to listen to it and share with others on as a podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So I'll just briefly introduce our speakers. Again, as I noted, they are both policy fellows, but Frank is a former U.S. Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and he also previously served as the Chief of Staff of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations under John Kerry. Yael Patir is the former executive director of J Street in Israel, and she also previously advised the European Union delegation to Israel and served as the chief of staff and senior diplomatic advisor for former Israeli Minister for Regional Cooperation, Isawi Frej. So thank you both for being here. And of course, for all of the analysis and writing that you do on a regular basis for J Street and for the policy community that we work with. I'm going to start with you, Frank, and I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit of an overview. As I noted, this is the third meeting that has taken place since Trump has returned to the White House here in Washington, D.C. What do you make of these repeated White House visits by Netanyahu? What does it signal about their relationship, specifically also compared to his relationship with other world leaders? And what would be your main takeaways from the conversation that we saw reported on last night, or other takeaways about what they might have discussed after reporters left the room?
Great. Thank you very much, Adina. Yeah, I do think it's notable that Netanyahu has come to the White House 3 times. I think that's more than any other leader. I think there's 2 elements to that that are important. The first is Israeli politics, and the second is U.S. politics, right? I think they serve each other's purposes politically. So I think if this Iran war hadn't been viewed by Israelis and by many Americans as a great success, Netanyahu wouldn't be here right now. It's a photo op. It's a chance for them to take, as many have said, a sort of a victory lap around all of that. So, and I think it obviously works very well for Netanyahu back home politically. I think it empowers him when it comes to some of the difficult conversations he needs to have on the political level, whether it be the Haredi conscription bill or obviously the Gaza ceasefire, any number of different issues there. So it's just good politics for both of them. But I think there's an important other point to make there, which is it does not suggest necessarily a close personal relationship. I think it's very transactional the way these two operate with each other. And we've seen, them go through big swings after, Bibi called Biden to congratulate him on getting elected president, which seems relatively innocuous. Probably, Trump viewed it as an act of great disloyalty, and so there was a freezing period there. And then Trump has gone behind Netanyahu's back on a number of different occasions, talking directly with Hamas, the Houthis, obviously the engagement with Iran. So I think that there's an element of political opportunism to this, but I don't think anybody should mistake that for a close personal relationship or any real trust between the two leaders. I think they both know that the other one's going to do whatever he wants, whatever he thinks is in his political, self-interest, and they'll sort of have to expect that the other's going to do that. So, I think it's positive for U.S.-Israel relations right now. Obviously, 3 visits to the White House is a big deal, and to have a very united front for now, anyway, between the U.S. and Israel, also, a positive thing for general relations between the countries. But I would just caution with a small note that this could change literally any minute, because that's the way those two guys operate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Yael.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, Yael, I would love to get your main takeaways from the meeting, and also just what you're hearing generally being reported in Israel about the meeting, about the significance, again, of the fact that this is the third meeting that's taking place. And I also would love for you to talk a little bit about what we heard about the status of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire talks and day after plan in Gaza.
Good evening from Tel Aviv. So nice to be with J Street and honored to share this conversation with Frank. Um, I want to open with this morning. I think that what happens each time that Netanyahu goes to DC, and especially in these last three meetings, is that we see the theatrics of politics in their best practice, and we all sit and wait for something big to happen, and all the news outlets and the programs are all like sitting on the tip of their toes, expecting the headlines. It looks like a reality show. News are like a reality show. What will happen? What will Trump say? How will they surprise us? The prime minister is delayed to leave on the plane, and we're all kind of hijacked in this news cycle. But then there are some things that are, make more greater pressing sad headlines, which is that this morning we woke up to the news of 5 Israeli soldiers that were killed in Gaza. And I looked up just before the conversation, and I saw, just to have my numbers balanced, that also the last 24 hours, there's a report of 50 people killed in Gazans killed. But this morning I heard on the radio Rabbi Elchanan Danino, who's the father of Ori Danino, who was a young soldier who was held hostage since October 7th. And exactly last year, he was murdered in the tunnel in that horrific day where 7 hostages were murdered. And he was saying in the radio that that we understand that this war cannot reach its declared goals. He said, and I quote, "Hamas cannot be defeated because it's an ideology, it's a religion, and the war just needs to end." And I think I'm bringing his quote because I think in to a great extent he's echoing what Israelis are feeling. But meanwhile, I just saw Netanyahu give a statement in Congress, just I think probably half an hour ago. And the statement was first in English and then it was in Hebrew, right? And the messages were very different. So when he talked to the American audience, I think this is very much what we saw in the meeting yesterday, which is he talked about the best cooperation ever in the last 77 years and really boost Trump. We saw it with the letter that he gave to recommend him to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, right? I mean, that's the kind of theatrics we see, and that's the messages that we heard in English, how wonderful we're doing, how great the cooperation, best friends of Israel, etc. And then when he moved to Hebrew, Netanyahu said, when he was asked about the ceasefire, he said that he's willing to see the end of the war in Gaza, but only when Hamas is defeated and there is no threat to Israel from Gaza. That basically is one of the gaps, let's say, between the sides. We know that their sides are now meeting in Doha, and negotiations are happening between Israel and Hamas, with Qatar and Egypt serving as mediators. And we're looking, according to recent reports, we're looking to Thursday as the day where maybe we'll hear that the ceasefire agreement was reached. Again, we didn't hear much about this in the meeting. There is an expected meeting to happen later today. Perhaps there will be some news coming from them, but also, like I said, it's just like we're being kept on edge, and then there's actually not significant news happening. But the ceasefire, I think everybody in Israel is very much expecting to hear some good news, and still the ceasefire agreement as it is now being negotiated is not a good one, right? In the sense that we won't see the end of the war. There will be a selection of 10 hostages that will be released in the first stage, and that won't even happen in the 60 days. If you want me to go to go into the details of what are the gaps between the sides, then I can do it now or later, Adina.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. And
Okay.
I want to thank you for kind of recentering us to what is really the most important thing. And you are 100% correct that, we all sit here waiting for, what's going to be the latest surprise that we're going to hear coming out of these meetings. But, we've been saying as J Street, and, this is the week that the war needs to end. It should have ended a long time ago. But like, again, we need to refocus exactly on the fact that there is a constant pattern of Netanyahu just trying to drag his feet and drag his feet. And of course, I'm not trying to say that, Hamas does not have responsibility here and they are not also dragging their feet. But there is, of course, this question about the leverage that this president has in sort of making sure this war ends now. And so I do want to turn to Frank and just ask you this question, which also echoes a question that we received in the Q&A. Trump has been saying this, I'm saying with confidence, this war, we're going to get a ceasefire and a hostage release within this week. Where do you think that confidence comes from? How realistic is that? And how much would that be more of a reality if he were to actually use the leverage and use the strength of his position vis-a-vis Netanyahu to make that a reality? And then after that, I would like to dive in with both of you about some of the sticking points that currently remain relating to the hostage and ceasefire negotiations. So Frank, over to you.
That was a great Washington, D.C. 8-part question. Tina, so I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. First of all, I think that from Trump's perspective, he really does want this ceasefire. And at some point, it begins to look like he's not the one really calling the shots with the Israelis. I mean, everybody knows that at the time that Israel launched the attacks on Iran, Trump had scheduled 3 days later a meeting with the Iranians, to continue those negotiations. So obviously, I think there was a green light of some kind from the Trump administration. It also wasn't what Trump wanted at that moment in time. So I think he's now, once the mission seemed to be successful, of course, he wanted to join in, and we attacked Iran, in our own right. But in any event, I think that there is a little bit of a risk from the Trump end that he's going to start to view this as Netanyahu being the one driving the relationship and driving the headlines, and he will not want to seem weak relative to Netanyahu. Now, that being said, I would be very surprised if he puts any real pressure on the Israelis. I think at this point, the dynamic is much more along the lines of Bibi saying, okay, I'll do this, which you want, if you'll do the following things, which I want. So you see things like, Trump issuing a statement saying that the trial ought to be called off because it's a witch hunt. That's purely for Netanyahu's domestic politics. I think he's asking for a whole bunch of different stuff in terms of actually ending this war, which we can get into later. But normalization of relations with Oman, a security agreement with Syria, conversations with Saudi on normalization. I think all of these things are what Netanyahu is asking Trump to do in return for Bibi doing what Trump wants him to do, which is to at least enter into a ceasefire now that Trump can claim credit for. Remember, Trump's narrative is, I'm an ender of wars. I keep U.S. out of foreign conflicts. I free hostages. So I think you do have some sort of pressures, if you will, on Trump to push Netanyahu, but I really wouldn't expect that to take the form of any kind of a real pressure on them. And I think what you'll see out of Netanyahu is a willingness to do a 60-day ceasefire with the return of 10 of the hostages. What he won't do is actually end the war, right? And that's so I think the best we can hope for here is that we'll have this period where there will be some sort of negotiations that likely won't go anywhere because Bibi's demands are so maximalist. He keeps repeating them. Now he shifted a little bit. He went from Hamas must be eliminated, right, to now he's saying Hamas must be defeated and militarily and politically, that sort of thing. So you can see a little bit of a shift there, and I think it goes to the fact that Hamas is in a really, really weakened position right now. If they had agreed to this deal, it's a function of the fact that they are in extremis in terms of their own politics, if you will. They've lost control. I've read reports of the vast majority of Gaza right now. They have really no command and control structure left. Most of their leaders have been killed. People are starting to rise up against them in various forms. We're starting to see armed militias rise up, some with Israel support, some not necessarily so. But in any event, they're losing their grip there. And so I think they may want this deal in order to see whether they can reestablish some element of control and regroup there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have accepted the core question here, which is, is this really going to lead to the end of the war or not? That's where they've been all the way along. It looks like they're moving off of that for all of those reasons. But it's not clear to me entirely that they've actually accepted the fact that this would really only be a 60-day ceasefire. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Yael. I'm sure you have obviously further thoughts on that.
Thanks, Frank. Wait, but I want to stick with you for just one more second to follow up with actually a specific question in the Q&A, and then Yael, I'll come back to you. Just in terms of Netanyahu's approach to Washington, can you talk about how you compare the way that Netanyahu is currently handling Trump to the way that he treated Biden in terms of sort of stringing along Washington while avoiding commitments to a permanent ceasefire, end of war?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's the same playbook. And honestly, it was the same playbook from when I was working for President Obama on all this stuff. And there was obviously a very famous moment on the White House lawn where President Trump expressed in expletives, how frustrating it was. And what I thought at that time was, Bibi does the same thing to everybody, right? None of us should take this personally. It doesn't matter who the president is. He's going to do his own thing. And if that's frustrating to an American president, kind of tough luck for us. So I see a dynamic here, which has really been consistent through Biden, through Trump, through Obama. Really, but go back to Bill Clinton when he asked, who's the superpower here? Netanyahu has a feeling that he can control the narrative in the United States, and he can put more pressure on an American president politically than they can put on him. I thought for a long time that wasn't true with Trump, and we saw he sort of pressured him into the first ceasefire. But now the U.S.-Israel relationship, from the Netanyahu perspective, has sort of rebalanced into firmly back to where it's always been, which is Bibi thinks he can just call the shots, and everybody's got to go along with it. And honestly, no one's proved him wrong yet, sadly.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, so over to you, Yael, about some of the sticking points that exist currently in the ceasefire negotiations. I just saw some push notification that Witkoff is saying, there were 4 key areas that needed to be resolved, and now we are left with 1 that's remaining. Can you shed a little bit of light on what he might be referring to there?
So the 4 key points as being reported are the following. One is about the humanitarian aid, where Hamas is demanding to go back to the old model pre the previous ceasefire, which basically means that the aid is distributed through the UN. On that front, we heard that Israel will agree, although, we haven't heard anything official, but that's, I think, maybe if I'm trying to analyze what Witkoff is saying, what is he taking off the 4 points? I think that's probably a safe one. The second is where the Israeli forces will be left during the ceasefire, where the demand is for the IDF to withdraw to where they were pre the current assault, and Israel is demanding to keep at least 1.2 kilometer, I think, into the strip, as well as some of the main routes. So that's the second point. The third is the promise to end the war. Hamas is demanding a commitment from the mediators that after the 60-day ceasefire, there won't be a renewal of fighting, and that there will be a promise that the war will end through negotiations. This is something that the Prime Minister, again, in the statement that he gave in Congress, he said that he has. I'll repeat what I said, that the war can end or would end when Hamas will not be in power in Gaza and Gaza will not threaten Israel. So that's his position. I think that's probably the one that is not being bridged. And then the fourth is really the key for releasing the hostages and the prisoners. Again, we know that 10 hostages, living hostages that are alive, are supposed to be released in this phased uh, 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 ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire, where 8 will be released at the beginning and two at the end, and 18 dead hostages that we don't know the identity of them, of course. And so that's the and there they haven't yet agreed on, the names and the key. Israel is very reluctant to release what is called as like prisoners, Palestinian prisoners that are symbols. But that's also, I think, one of the 4 points that we can imagine that could be agreed on, and the same kind of structure and key that was agreed on in the past.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to jump
Yeah.
in real quickly on that, I think it's worth stressing point number 3 there, because that has been the holdup to ceasefires, other than the one that Trump sort of bullied Bibi into in January, that all the way along back over a year now. And so I'm just not entirely sure that there's actually been a meeting of the minds on that. I think if Hamas is asking for guarantees of some kind, which is what they're really looking for. Right now, it's guarantee that the United States will make best efforts to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion, that kind of thing. But as far as I can tell, there's nothing in there that will prevent Bibi from doing more or less what he said he's going to do, which is to resume the war when this is over. So again, if Hamas agrees to that now, it's a function of the fact that they're in a very, very weakened position. But I'm not. I don't. I think before we say, oh, gee, we're almost at the finish line there. Just remember that it's the biggest issue that is yet to be resolved. And I think there's a lot of reasons to think it will be, but I also think there's a lot of reasons to be cautious, because it wouldn't be the first time that both sides have played the game of, oh yeah, we said yes, it was the other guy that said no. And so what's encouraging is that Netanyahu doesn't seem to be looking for excuses now. Like, we've had issues arise in the past. Oh, I need to stay in the Netzarim corridor, that sort of thing. If he doesn't want to deal for political reasons, there's any number of excuses that he can come up with. Sometimes he takes new positions. I don't know. Yeah, correct me if I'm mistaken, but it doesn't feel to me right now as if Netanyahu is trying to find a way out of this for political purposes. But maybe you could, if I'm allowed to ask a quick question, what do you think? What do you make of Netanyahu's politics domestically? Is he ready for a ceasefire here?
What I wanted to ask anyway, Frank. So
Okay, good. Thanks.
So,
And what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say? What threats can they level against him, and what kind of leverage does he have?
So I think exactly the kind of rhetorics that we heard from Netanyahu when he was giving his statements in Hebrew were exactly the kind of language that he borrowed from Ben-Gvir and from Smotrich, and that's his way of signaling to them that he's not, going to break um this position of basically. I mean, there's two things that we've heard recently, right? One is Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's position of, we need to suffocate the Gazans and we need the maximist pressure approach, and they will cave, which Netanyahu kind of supported, and also went on record in the cabinet to fight the chief of staff and to tell them, you're not strong enough. So this is one place where we see him kind of aligned, and it tells us something about the pressure he feels from within his coalition and the need to keep it intact. And then the second is the whole conversation about these humanitarian cities that we heard from the Israeli Minister of Defense. 600,000 people mobilized to a city in the southern part of the Strip. We heard in recent days about all sorts of horrendous plans. Here too, this was also a point of friction inside the cabinet. And again, we heard the chief of staff saying not only that it's not feasible to ask the IDF for this kind of a mission, but also it's not one of the goals that the cabinet gave to this war. And and in a way, for me, it's kind of him like unveiling these tactics of rhetorics that don't have any plans behind them. So as you said before, Netanyahu is somebody who's always about controlling the narrative. We call him a spin doctor here. You have your president is kind of the chaos agent, and our prime minister is the spin doctor, and it's when we listen to what he says, we always have to think about two things. One is what he's saying for his coalition, and second is what the government is saying as negotiation tactics. And I don't know what is when I think about negotiation tactics, so I said, okay, at least they're not really planning on doing it. They're just using it to pressure Hamas, and maybe it is a good sign in terms of seeing progress in the ceasefire negotiations. But it doesn't look at the moment that the coalition is at the point of a break, either from the Zionist nationals, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, or from the Haredi. But the pot is really boiling, and the pressure on the prime minister is coming from all ends. And this is a government that is based on pressure politics and on these small groups trying to get the maximum that they can from the cake of the government. So that's the but at this point, with the Knesset going out to recess at the end of the month until mid-October, I don't see anything happening before the recess. And once the Knesset is out, then the risk of the government falling is off the table, at least for until October.
Thanks, Yael. I want to follow up with questions from the chat about, and also to touch on something that you said about the Chief of Staff of the IDF and their comments, or his comments recently, and other comments from reserve soldiers, etc. Well, one question is relating to the hostages and the families of the hostages, and in terms of pressure points and groups within the Israeli public that are seeking to put pressure on the government. What do you see as the pressure that they have right now on Netanyahu in terms of getting to a reality in which all of the hostages can be released, and not just 10 hostages? And then the second thing, in terms of another group, right, is the security echelons and the Chief of Staff of the IDF clearly coming out against the Minister of Defense in his horrendous humanitarian cities proposal, but also talking about how the war has essentially reached its sort of strategic endgame. What influence do these two factors have on Netanyahu in light of the other coalition dynamics that you just outlined?
So it's with a broken heart. I have to say that I don't think that the hostage families have any leverage over the prime minister. And even with the mobilization of the public, and with the public polls, where we see that there really is a serious majority of the public that wants to see the end of the war and the release of all hostages, and is willing even to pay the price. I don't see this pressuring the prime minister. I mean, we've seen him again and again, sort of brushing off this kind of pressure. Also, today in the news cycles, we heard from all the opposition leaders, including Avigdor Lieberman and Lapid and Yair Golan. They all came out against the prime minister, and they used the five fallen soldiers as kind of their statements about what is happening in Gaza, to say that it's clear that the war in Gaza is political and it's there only to keep the coalition. Lieberman saying that he got a lot of pushback from the right in general, right, is his base. So he got a lot of pushback from right-wing media for kind of uh, um, acting and talking against like national interest and so on. But the opposition, when it comes to the war in Gaza, the opposition is very clear and having a, you know, kind of the same line um, uh, when it comes to talking about this being a political war rather than one that really has Israel's best security interest in mind. So that's about the family and the opposition, the way in which it affects the coalition. I'm you know, sad to say that not so much. In terms of the IDF, it's very complicated to answer. Like on the one hand, as I said, there was pushback from the chief of staff Eyal Zamir, and he warned in the cabinet about the plans to relocate the Gazans, that they're unrealistic and dangerous. And then Netanyahu was quoted saying in the cabinet, you know, very, very strongly, prepare an evacuation plan. I want it ready when I come back from Washington. Within the army, it's again, it's clear these are negotiation tactics. And I think that Haaretz is doing a very good job in exposing the voices of the soldiers that we don't really get to hear. But still, I would say that the common, you know, attitude is that in a way, the fallen soldiers are used to justify the continued war, so their death won't be in vain. The threats are still there. People who serve in the army live the reality of these threats, and it's very clear to them that what they are doing is a security mission. And so, you know, I don't see. I wouldn't expect us to see a, I don't know, a revolt from the IDF or something like that, if that's what we're asking about.
Thanks, Yael. Yeah, Frank.
So yeah, just to jump in, it's an excellent summary, and I think everybody really needs to pay very close attention to the domestic political situation in Israel, because so much of what Netanyahu winds up doing is a function of what's sort of below the surface to a lot of outside observers, which is what is the internal politics suggests. And I think it sounds to me like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir do not have the ability to pull down the coalition now until at least October. So that would give Bibi some space to do the 60-day ceasefire. I think almost notwithstanding what they say, and probably with a little bit of help from Trump there. I think the bigger question is, what are Israel's long-term intentions in Gaza, right? Because we know that Hamas has been decimated to an extreme degree now. Netanyahu could just declare victory, and I think many in the IDF would say, hey, we've achieved the mission that was set out for us. Hamas as a military entity doesn't really exist any longer. You have small bands of militants who pop out of tunnels and try to fire at us, but really they're not controlling any territory or functioning as a military. So he has the option in terms of looking at this through the political prism to say, yes, we've won, or no, the battle must go on until we've sort of eliminated every one of these guys. But so aside from the security question, right, I think there's a question of what are Israel's long-term intentions in Gaza Strip right now, right? And there is certainly a very strong voices in the Israeli coalition and probably in Israeli society that don't ever want to leave at least half of Gaza, right? I think the northern part of Gaza, they have designs on turning that into part of Israel sort of permanently, right? And basically, driving as many Palestinians as they can into the southern part of the country in hopes that they will leave. I think that is, a legitimate interpretation of the Israeli government's formal position on this. And so I'll be very interested to see whether Donald Trump mentions the Gaza Riviera plan or not tonight, because if that is really Israel's intention and the United States continues to back them up on this war is never going to end. Right, it will end only when they've consolidated control over the north, to the point where they can start building Israeli settlements if they want to, but in any event, prevent any Palestinians from doing any reconstruction or rebuilding or returning to their homes there, and then just force everybody into the southern part of the country and wait till the situation gets so miserable that maybe some of them start to leave in droves. So I really think that's what we need to be asking ourselves right now. The 60-day ceasefire, I really hope it happens for the hostages, for their families. For the 2 million people in Gaza who are desperately in need. of a massive increase in humanitarian assistance. But I don't think anybody should make the mistake of thinking that this is really going to end the war unless Netanyahu and the Israelis have made the decision that they have no long-term designs on controlling Gaza, that they really are willing to withdraw at some point. And even then, I'm pretty sure that they will maintain a much, much stronger security presence there. They'll have these corridors in Gaza that sort of split up the land, and they keep control over those. And so it's going to be a very different reality in Gaza altogether going forward. But I think just a simple takeaway from all of this is, what does Israel really want? What does this government of Israel want over the long term in Gaza? Because it may very well be mutually exclusive with any kind of a permanent ceasefire agreement.
And can I just jump in, Frank, and add that, you ended by saying, what does Israel want? What does the government of Israel want? And I think, that the biggest problem is that the government of Israel does not represent what the state of Israel or the people of Israel want, like 100%. And what we're seeing with this government is really the weakness and the holes in the Israeli democracy, because Israel is being ruled by a government that is composed of minority groups that are imposing their agenda without any responsibility towards the broader public, what we call the kingdom. We say a mamlachtiyut in Hebrew, and this fight that we've seen in the cabinet between the chief of staff and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and they're using these fights for their own purposes and their own public, right? When they're really pushing for a military regime in Gaza. And that's their agenda, which is really does not represent in any case the majority of the public in Israel. And what is even more ridiculous, that it's coming from two ministers that themselves does not serve in the IDF. I mean, it's.
What if we wouldn't have a single seat in the Knesset if the elections were held tomorrow?
Exactly.
I do want to note, just Frank, what you were saying in terms of, Trump's Gaza Riviera plan. I don't know if you noticed also in the conversation yesterday when he was being asked about that exact plan, he essentially turned over the answer to that question to Netanyahu, which I think was quite notable. And of course, Netanyahu then noted that they are in conversation with several other countries to, find a way for Gazans to voluntarily emigrate outside of Gaza. So it does seem that in terms, at least of the plans, there is a clear driving force coming from Netanyahu to continue to push this forward, and Trump seems to be ceding that ground to Netanyahu, and unfortunately, what that means is to the right flank of his coalition to be moving that forward, and not to the chief of staff of the IDF or other security experts. I'm going to shift gears, though. I know we could talk about Gaza ceasefire components, but I do want to also talk about Iran, because obviously that was the significant element of the victory lap of this visit, and I imagine there was more to the conversation that we did not hear following the reporters' questions. And Frank, I would like for you to talk a little bit about where you see the prospects for diplomacy with Iran at this state and time. Trump did allude to the fact that there will be talks directly with Iran, also willingness to lift sanctions. And it's been reported that Netanyahu has very clear interests in coming here to stake out a marker as to what would be his red lines in conversations with Iran. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your understanding is from where those conversations between the United States and Iran are going?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think, first of all, the deadline to understand is the snapback of the UN sanctions that were paused in effect during the JCPOA era. So those are designed to snap back into place in October of this year, unless there's an affirmative decision by the Security Council to continue them, right? So the default will be that the sanctions will snap back into place now. And so in order to prevent that outcome, which would result in Iran facing far more significant sanctions than they already face. So these would be multilateral international sanctions, a little bit different than the US and EU type sanctions that they're looking at right now. So I think that really provides an impetus for the Iranians to sit down in the first instance with the Europeans, who will sort of control that decision to a large degree, but also with us, and try to figure out if there's a different way forward or not. I think what the Israelis' position is, we know, I don't think, and I've been in a million of those meetings with Netanyahu, but you don't have to have any experience to understand what he's going to say, which is zero enrichment, no ballistic missile program, no support for proxies. That's our position in negotiations. The Iranians are weak. They're barely hanging on to power there, the IRGC and the mullahs. So hit them while they're down, make them concede on every point before you even consider removing sanctions. So you can bet that the Netanyahu line is just the strongest possible line. The other side of that is that there really is no point in having a negotiation just around the question of enrichment. In my view at this point in time, just because our position is now similar to the Israelis on that one discrete issue, which is that I don't think we'll allow any enrichment to occur, right? Whether I think under the prior Witkoff proposal, and this may be why Israel started the war to begin with, we were going to allow enrichment for an interim period, right, at very low levels, while this international consortium was going to be set up, which would provide the enriched uranium to Iran and others in the region. And so now I think our position is not sort of low level enrichment for a short period of time until another. So it's just no enrichment period. And obviously the Iranians have a year or two at a minimum before they could get any large scale enrichment program back up and running, right? So at the same time, the Iranians are saying over and over and over again to anybody who will listen, we're not giving up our rights to enrich. So you can have a conversation where you sit there and go back and forth around the same set of issues and make zero progress, or you can try to be creative. And I think what the initial conversation may be about right now is get the inspectors back in. I think that's what people are most concerned about. That's what I'm most concerned about. Is we don't know where the highly enriched uranium is, right? People think maybe it was in Fordow, maybe it's deep underground in Natanz somewhere, but there's 10 bombs worth of 60% enriched uranium that is totally unaccounted for there. And a month ago, that was under the supervision of the IAEA, right? And now nobody knows where it is. And the IAEA, the Iranians voted to suspend cooperation with the IAEA. So I think that the Iranian leverage in the snapback negotiations is to say, look, we'll let the inspectors back in. And in return for that, you don't snap those sanctions back, or you don't snap all of them back. So I think that there's a discrete negotiation that can occur around inspections and additional sanctions that might bear some fruit. But in my mind, and I think Trump has actually alluded to this, and I've said it publicly before, but I think it's time to have a bigger conversation with the Iranians, which may have a different sort of dynamic than it's had in the past, where you do get them to do what Israel's asking for, which is end the ballistic missile program in any sort of threatening way. To stop rebuilding not to rebuild the proxies and not to rebuild the enriched facilities. And they've refused to do that in the past. Kerry's negotiations, which I was adjacent to for all those years, our strongly held view was that there's no point in having this discussion with Iran and all the rest of the stuff. And Trump came to the same conclusion. There's no point in having conversation with the Iranians about ballistic missiles and proxies because it'll never go anywhere. We have all we can handle on the enriched program. But I think Iran's in a different position now, just in the sense that they would have to rebuild all of their enrichment facilities. Whereas before they were giving up something that existed, now they're giving up the potential to rebuild something that actually doesn't currently really exist. Same thing is true for the proxies. Hezbollah has basically been decimated. Obviously, we saw it happen to Assad in Syria, and a lot of the militias in Iraq have been weakened. The Houthis are doing what they do, but they're sort of a sidelight here. So can you get the Iranians to the point where you said, hey, listen, you can have a very different relationship with the whole region here and really with the whole world. You need to give up all of this stuff. And in return for that, we'll give you, basically normalization of relations in effect with the United States and with the region and foreign investment. And, is Iran willing to entertain that kind of conversation? Because I think that there's a more reason to believe that could succeed than there ever has been in the past. And if that is the case, then you really do have the opportunity not to change the regime in Iran, which I think is a pipe dream, but to change the calculus and the behavior of the regime, which I do think is a realistic outcome. So we'll see if anybody's willing to embrace that. I think it would need to include the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else, right? Like the JCPOA did, but it's really got to be a global offer to the Iranians because they simply do not trust the United States and they certainly don't trust Israel. So, could you pull together that kind of dynamic in a conversation? And if nothing else, put the choice to the Iranian people. And again, they don't actually get to choose anything, but that might put a little bit more pressure on the regime. If there was a hard offer to completely change their behavior and then to completely change their relationship with the rest of the world. I think it's worth having a conversation about that now. Sorry, I went on too long.
No, that was great, Frank, and I appreciate you, providing sort of a comprehensive overview as to what needs to be taken into consideration in this path forward. I'm gonna pull from a question here in the Q&A that looks at sort of the geopolitical landscape, the state of Hezbollah, the state of Iran right now, the Houthis, Hamas, and Yael, this is a question for you, and I'd love also, Frank, for you to add on to this. What of course remains is still, the broader issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so the question in the Q&A is sort of what is the strategy? What is the end game that Netanyahu is looking at when he looks at this geopolitical reality, but is not, of course, willing to entertain anything that addresses the reality in his own backyard with Palestinians? Where do you see Netanyahu leading us?
That's over to you, Yael.
Is it? I think that where is Netanyahu leading us? Netanyahu is telling us that he can expand normalization in the region without providing any day after plan in Gaza, without promoting Palestinian statehood. There are, according to his messaging, there are states that are willing to absorb Gazans. There is, with the assistance of the US, there's a lot of interests that are around the table that can be played with to provide different states and regimes with their needs. We've seen it in the Abraham Accords, which was, I think for all of us a big surprise to see that things that Palestinian can be jumped over, and the interests of the players in the region are stronger than their loyalty towards the Palestinians. So I think in that sense, we are not seeing anything new. Whether it's practical, I don't think so. Netanyahu has always has been a man of kicking the can down the road and looking for favorable conditions. I don't think that there's any master plan, as he's alluded to, even for the day after in Gaza, again, as he said in his statement in Congress just an hour ago. So I think we have to be extremely cautious. He has a lot of balls in the air, whether it's holding his coalition, it's his trial that we didn't mention this conversation, but obviously it is probably the first thing on his mind, and everything is organized to serve the purpose of him avoiding the trial and avoiding the ultimate price of his indictment, and so that's I don't know. I think more than that to say about his broader plan. Maybe Frank does.
Yeah, I think what he's really trying to do here is do the minimum amount he possibly can for the Palestinians and still get normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. That's kind of the simplest way to look at it. And the real question will become, what is Saudi Arabia demand? Certainly an end of the war in Gaza would be a minimum, but they've moved now the goalpost to firm commitment to create a Palestinian state, concrete steps on the path towards statehood, that kind of thing. So I think that Netanyahu's long-term vision is to maintain as much of the West Bank under Israeli control as he can, maintain as much of Gaza Strip under Israeli control, whether that's just military control or whether there's additional settlements there or not, I think remains to be seen. But he wants to control as much of this land as he possibly can and still get a peace with Saudi Arabia out of it. So I think that at the end of the day, where we'll see Netanyahu make a choice is if the Saudis put something to him that says you must do this concrete thing, right? Transition from Area C to Area B in the West Bank, something that would require the Knesset support, and it would be a difficult political decision in return for the big prize of normalization. At which point, I think we would probably go to elections in Israel, and I think that may be Netanyahu's sort of medium-term political agenda here is to say, okay, this coalition ends in 2026 anyway. Maybe I'm going to have elections, 6 months earlier, and that'll be a package deal where I end the war in Gaza. Although his definition of end the war in Gaza, as I said, is going to entail it'll still entail a large scale IDF, component and presence to it there. But the war technically ends, and then they say something vague about a Palestinian state in the future, pending reforms by the PA, which they'll be the sole judge of the effectiveness of. And in return for that, he gets normalization of relations. That, I think, is his big prize. That's his version of the Nobel Prize for Netanyahu. So I think that's sort of his North Star. And it was, by the way, back in the Obama administration. I remember him telling Kerry and Obama that we had to go to the Saudis and offer them, land for peace in return for which they would recognize, normalize relations with Israel. And we were like, that's obviously never going to happen. But that does remain the sort of the goal that he is heading towards. I think the real important point from my perspective anyway is look what's happening on the ground, not what these guys are saying. Look at what they're doing. And you're seeing what's happening in the West Bank right now. Obviously, the situation has gotten much worse recently with the Hilltoppers are attacking IDF. I mean, the whole thing is complete chaos there, and there's absolute impunity for the settlers. And what I think is going to happen effectively on the ground is they're just going to clear as many Palestinians as they possibly can out of Area C, right? And so again, what Netanyahu would like to do is what he's always done, which is to create facts on the ground and say, obviously, we can't change what exists there, but we're willing to freeze, and we'll allow the Palestinians to build more in A and B and give them a little extra land. So that's the deal that he's heading towards right now. But look, again, just what's happening on the ground in Gaza. Are people being allowed to return to the north? Does Israel really have any intention of allowing people to go back to Jabalia, to Gaza City, to any of those places? And look what's happening in the West Bank now. Do they have any, is there any resistance at all inside of Israel to, basically continuing to push the Palestinians out of Area C fairly systematically? Because I think that's what he's going to continue to do with Saudi normalization, the possibility of elections to end the war in Gaza on the medium-term horizon.
And maybe we should also, sorry, Dina.
Yeah, no, please.
No, I just wanted to mention Syria as the small prize. I think the U.S. administration is thinking that they can offer Syria as a gesture, so to speak, or a win for Netanyahu that might also make him more flexible on Gaza or on the Palestinian issue. The interesting thing is that there's no public discussion in Israel about Syria. I mean, so I don't know the extent to which it would be perceived as a win, and it's clear that there won't be any. There's not a possibility for a peace agreement with Syria. I mean, we could see some kind of an agreement on, similar to the agreements we saw with Lebanon, something that is more militarily security based and has to do with the sides committing to keep some rules of engagement. But again, I don't see how Syria itself gains traction, and also helping push for the Palestinian track. So on Syria, also, as I mentioned, it seems more that it's about messaging and less about practical plans. I do have to mention that there was news today about a meeting between as a very senior Israeli official. At one point, they said that it was Tzachi Hanegbi meeting in Abu Dhabi, Ahmed al-Shara. But then Tzachi Hanegbi was in Washington, so I don't know how he could have been in both places. So now the headlines are just saying a very senior Israeli official, which is, a serious sign. And we're looking for Ashara's speech in the UN, so that might, be a timeline to look at more towards September.
Yeah, just real quickly on that one, we did negotiations with Bashar Assad and Netanyahu over Syria, really over Golan, Kerry, and I did in 2010 and 2011. And what Netanyahu really is going to want out of that is de facto acknowledgement from the Syrians that Golan is not coming back to them, right? That's really the prize as far as he's concerned. And again, whatever security agreement they can come to is going to boil down to some version of you don't shoot at me and I don't shoot at you.
Right.
Except Israel will retain the overarching ability to defend itself in whatever manner it sees fit and any time it sees fit, right? So at the end of the day, Israel will be bound by very little in all of this, and what Netanyahu will be looking for out of it is acknowledgement and effect. And there's land they've taken on the other side of Golan now, on the other side of Mount Hernon. And I think that they're going to want de facto acknowledgement that those guys can stay there. I think that's really what the Israelis are really looking for out of that deal.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I wanted to end on that point of prospects for a potential non-aggression pact détente with Syria. And so I appreciate you both weighing in on that point. And then, of course, also Frank, for reminding us about, of course, the reality on the ground in the West Bank and the facts on the ground in the West Bank. We know now, of course, that there is like real threats of demolitions and displacements and firing Zone 918 in Masafariyata in the South Hebron Hills. And in terms of pressure and what can be done on these issues, aside from the fact that, yes, there is this U.S., Israel, Trump, Netanyahu alliance on a series of issues, there is the broader international community, and we have seen other international actors having an influence on the reality on the ground in the West Bank. And I think, of course, Congress and our allies in Congress still have a role to play. And there's a series of issues that have come up that we didn't even really get to dive into, both relating to the Gaza Humanitarian Fund and the roles that Congress can play to hold the United States accountable, and also to send a message that echoes the messages from our international allies and partners on these very serious issues that require international involvement to raise to the headlines when it isn't necessarily coming to the headlines in Israel, unfortunately. So specifically, the reality on the ground in the West Bank for Palestinians and displacement. We have 2 minutes left before we close. I just wanted to give each of you the opportunity for any, closing remarks, things that you think we should keep our eyes open for in the week ahead, and to thank you both for your analysis and expertise. So Yael, I'll go to you, and then I'll turn to Frank.
I think I would say that Netanyahu, despite him, being relatively strong in the polls, he's still in a constant fight for survival, and he's fighting on multiple fronts, on the military, the political, the legal. And in doing so, he's dragging Israel, and by extension, our relationship with the US and with American Jews, into very dangerous territory. You talked about some of the actions that J Street is doing, and you are all much more exposed than me to the impact of this government and of this war on the relationship. And I think what we're seeing now is again is theatrics. We never know what they're agreeing on behind closed door. We're always waiting for some kind of a surprise. But the avoidance of dealing with the truth and being accountable and presenting a vision of peace that includes the Palestinians is what we're really looking for. And thanks that we have J Street to make sure that we're keeping our eyes on track. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Yael.
Yeah,
Frank?
I think we're out of time, and I think that was an excellent note to leave it on. So thank you very much, Adina. Very well done. And yeah, always a pleasure. I learned a lot from this one. So thanks to you both.
Thank you both so much. And thank you to all of our attendees for this webinar. Of course, as we noted, you can go to our YouTube channel to see a recording of the discussion, and also to share our podcast recording of it on Spotify and Apple's podcasts. And thank you again, and wishing us all continued strength and hope for achieving a ceasefire and hostage deal this week. So thank you very much. Take care.